Now we come to the topic of spatial positioning, or three-dimensional depth. In the previous tutorial, we discussed panorama, which is simply the left-to-right positioning of an instrument. But we also have the front-to-back positioning of instruments. With spatial positioning, or where these instruments appear in a virtual room, once again there is much discussion about how to achieve this in the best way. But ultimately, it falls down to personal taste as to how you achieve this. But here we would like to show you how we prefer to achieve spatial depth. Of course, the methods we will show you can be translated to any instrument, not just orchestral instruments. So here we can see that we have three separate effect channels, and each of these channels has a unique processor inserted. If I open the mixer and look at the effect on the first channel, the so-called front channel, we can see that I have inserted a concert hall, and this is a convolution reverb. A convolution reverb uses an impulse response, or in effect a sample of a real ambient space, and imposes this onto whatever signal is passed through it. A reverb is usually made up of two elements, the first being the early reflections. If you imagine clapping your hands in the room, the slap-back effect that you hear will be the early reflections bouncing back off of the walls. This doesn't give the actual ambient effect. The actual reverb comes from the tail of the reverb. Most reverb effects will give you both the early reflections and the tails in order to achieve a realistic reverb effect. If we look at our plugin here, we can see a graphic display, and for the minute it is simply showing the early reflections. The reason for this is that the early reflection tail mix parameter that we can see here is set to 0. This means we have no reverb tail in the mix. What we have done is to insert the tail of the reverb on our master channel, and we are using the same convolution style effect, but only having the tail and not the early reflections. The reason we have inserted it onto the master or stereo output channel is that we want our orchestra to appear as it is in a virtual space, and we want all instruments to be in that same space. If we compare this to a pop production, the difference would be that we may not have any reverb on, for example, a bass drum, but we might have quite a lot on the guitars. However, when discussing the orchestra, the overall room effect will be on all the instruments. But what is different is how the instruments react with the early reflections. On a horn section, for example, the early reflections will, in general, be more noticeable than on a solo violin. If we look at our graphic and choose the viola section, we can see that they are quite far forwards and close to the conductor. If we play our viola instrument, we can hear that it is very dry. There is no reverb on the instrument itself, and this gives the impression of the instrument being directly in front of the listener. If we now go to our reverb plugin that is on the front channel, we can activate it and listen to the viola with some early reflections. We can hear when the early reflection is activated that the instrument has a slightly increased ambience around it. But if we look here in the pre-delay parameter, we can see that the early reflections have no pre-delay. What this means is that the early reflection sound appears at the same time as the instrument itself, and in reality this cannot happen. What actually happens is that the viola plays, the sound of the viola travels to the walls, and is then reflected back to the listener, and this all takes time. If we now go to our pre-delay parameter and increase it, we are in effect moving the walls away from the instrument, and the longer the pre-delay, the larger the room will be. We can clearly hear this if we set the pre-delay to a larger number, such as 255 milliseconds. Now, however, we have to decide what a realistic delay will be for our instruments. Of course, you could do a mathematical calculation based on, for example, where the listener or conductor is, and measuring the distance from the instrument and the wall, but this would be taking things a bit too far. Personally, I think the best option is to adjust the pre-delay until it sounds natural to you. In this case, if we set it to 40, we can hear that the instrument has some ambience. But it does not jump out as sounding unnatural. Now, what we have been listening to is simply the early reflections. And in order to activate the reverb, I simply go to our stereo out channel or master bus and activate our reverb tail plugin. We can see that this is set to 100% tail mix here. So now, our signal path, starting with the viola, is going partially into the early reflections, which in turn is going into the reverb tail, and also directly from the viola to the reverb. Now if we listen, we can clearly hear the reverb. But to be honest, the early reflections seem harder to notice. If we can hear anything, it is extremely subtle, and one has to question whether it is really important in the context of a full mix of instruments. It is clear that an instrument needs reverb to sound natural, but to adjust the early reflections individually is probably in most cases not entirely necessary. What does help, however, is using the balance of instrument to reverb. If we lower the volume of the viola, it will push the instrument away from the listener. A side effect of this, however, is that the early reflections which are going into the reverb are also lowered in volume, and in this case, this is not what we want. We want the direct sound to be pushed back, but the reverb effect should not disappear. In order to achieve this, we can change our effect sends from post-fader to pre-fader. This means that the send is taken before the fader, and so is no longer affected by the fader. So now, as we can hear by moving the fader down, the instrument is moved away from the listener and therefore has more spatial depth. Another way to move an instrument further back, away from the listener, is to lower the brightness of the instrument slightly. So in this example, I have opened an equalizer, and by lowering the higher frequencies and adjusting the volume of the instrument, the instrument appears more in the distance. Then we also have the option of panning the instrument, and adding these things together certainly pushes the instrument into a different spatial position. Unfortunately, there aren't really any shortcuts. You will have to find the correct spatial placement for the specific task at hand. The goal of making a virtual orchestra sound identical to a real orchestra is probably wishful thinking, and certainly when combined with other instruments, not really a goal worth pursuing. However, certain rules do apply and are the same as they are for other instruments. If you want an instrument to appear in the forefront, then it should be louder than an instrument that should appear to be in the distance somewhat. An instrument that is in the distance will appear quieter and slightly less bright, and will almost certainly have more ambience. The time required for setting individual pre-delays, early reflections, and reverbs, along with other parameter settings, especially if you are trying to do this for an entire orchestral library, will be extreme. And also using the independent plugins for individual instruments will require a lot of computer power. But in the case of the VSL library that we are using right now, there is another option available to us. And this is the optional MIR-X or MIR-X convolution reverb for VSL. If it has been installed, it will be available here, and basically these are additional sampled reverbs that can be applied to specific instruments. MIR is also available as a standalone product that can be used with other libraries. And of course, there are other options available, such as the virtual soundstage from Parallax Audio, which is available in a Lite and Pro version. And even the Lite version is a very useful product. You can insert it on an instrument and position that instrument within the virtual sound stage. In short, there are many options available to you, but the most important one will be finding the method that suits you most. In the end, working with pre- and post-fade sends and careful use of volume and panning, you can create wonderful sounding orchestral arrangements for any style of music. And ultimately, time is of the essence. And these days, especially in music production, time is money. So finding an efficient method is often more important than the specific tools that you use. So, in summing up, we can say that working with the volume of your instruments is central to creating depth. Taming the high end of an instrument by cutting the treble slightly will help push it backwards in the sound field. And by having your reverb on a pre-fade send, the feeling of depth and the perceived amount of reverb will increase as you lower the level of the instrument. Also, if you wish to bring an instrument to the forefront within an arrangement, one of the best ways can be to automate the volume. A final tip is to find a library that offers the features you need, but also takes away as much of the technical work as possible. There is no need to spend hours and hours on technical details if the library already sounds excellent and offers you the facilities straight out of the box to create a realistic virtual orchestra without having to rely on multiple extra plugins. Your virtual orchestra should sound good straight away whilst playing the instruments into your DAW, and shouldn't need you to spend hours creating a decent balance.